Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO Jing's series on the Final Fight franchise, where I review every single entry as a retrospective, and if you can count to 3, we are on Final Fight 3 today. And I would say that this game is bigger, larger, and better than Final Fight 2, and I really did enjoy Final Fight 2 in that review as well. But we have a completely different storyline now, but we are back in Metro City after the world tour we took in Final Fight 2, and I would say Metro City is a better host to this overall brawling action. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But the Skullcross Gang is the name of the game today because the Mad Gear Gang has been purged from Metro City and the world, and we have a new antagonist gang to take on in Final Fight 3. And even though I am playing as Lucia here to talk about the new characters, do remember the only right way to play this game is to use Mike Hagar. He is the mayor of the city and he should be out in front. But I would say I enjoy Final Fight 3 slightly more than I do Final Fight 2. Even if you read contemporary reviews, you will hear that most people preferred Final Fight 2 back in the day. But I think there was a situation in which there was a little bit of exhaustion from the franchise because you had 3 games in pretty rapid succession on the Super Nintendo. So by the time you get to the number 3, maybe people were just a little bit bored of the formula, where if you take them in a retrospective fashion and weigh them against each other, it isn't that big of a deal. And I do love the fact that everything in Metro City seems to be made out of paper mache, because kicking through walls and destroying architecture is the name of the game here. And if those glasses aren't from They Live, I would be highly surprised. It always makes me think of that. But I enjoy Final Fight 3 slightly more than 2 because it's a bigger game with a more diverse set of enemies to fight. Final Fight 2 was a ton of fun, but once you saw the first level, you basically saw every single enemy in the game outside of the varying bosses. And if Dave here reminds you of anybody, it definitely is just kind of inspired by the original Final Fight. And I do like the fact that they give you a good amount of story in Final Fight 3 as well, because even though this franchise is known as an arcade franchise, the only arcade release was the original Final Fight, with 2 and 3 just being home console games. So it's kind of interesting that people always associate this series with the arcades, even though only one of the games actually came out in arcades, unless you count Final Fight Revenge as a Sega Titan video release. I do love the graphics here as well. They're a bit bigger and a bit more colorful than Final Fight 2, and we still have that same ability to walk up and down into the screen in certain spots, something you really didn't see in the original Final Fight. And if you play these games out of order, I definitely recommend starting with 3 and then moving over to 2. There's just something about 3 that feels completely different than the original arcade version, even though it is still a beat 'em up. It is my preferred way to play. And I love all the enemy names here. Fat Jack, and then soon you're going to be fighting Arby. I assume he's been going to Arby's a little bit too much. But everything here is exactly the same competent beat 'em up mechanics that you got in the original 2 Final Fight games, save for one tiny omission or issue. The hit detection on some bosses can be a little bit wonky. And if you watch the channel and you know what I think about beat 'em ups, hit detection is 100% the most important thing in any of these games. It's not in every single boss, but Coleman here, you do have to line up near to perfectly to actually strike him. You will feel like you should be hitting him, but you're going to be missing more often than not. So that is a tiny miss. But graphically, this game is definitely expanded upon compared to the second game in the series, and obviously the first on the Super Nintendo as well. I love these pastel colors in the backgrounds, those purples that kind of fall off into gray. The entirety of Metro City here looks so pretty, and you get a lot of destructible environments as well, able to kick enemies into that glass or breaking statuary in the actual scene. And once you get to the golden hour sunset with Metro City in the background on this bridge, with that little bit of sunlight sparkle at the horizon line, it looks absolutely spectacular, and I would say this is probably the prettiest game of all 3. Sure, the CPS original has better graphics technically, but I prefer Final Fight 3 to the overall style that it shows on the screen. And of course, Andori is going to be back because you're never going to miss out on a good Andori match. And I would have to say, compared to Final Fight 2, I actually prefer the soundtrack in Final Fight 3 a little bit better. It's got a little bit more bass, a little more reverb, and a little bit more fun in the overall soundtrack. So go ahead and listen for 45 seconds and I'll come back, talk more about the history of the game and why I prefer it to 2. But enjoy. Just awesome Capcom music, because Capcom always gave us great music in the games, and again, there's just something a little bit more lively about the musical soundtrack in Final Fight 3 that I prefer. But Drake here, definitely a relatively cheap boss, but honestly, what boss in a beat 'em up game isn't kind of cheap? Just definitely make sure you jump when he ground pounds and you should be fine. And we even get a little bit more exposition here, finding out what the cargo hold of the ship had in it, and giving us a name to kind of move along with the story. I would say, as far as the console Final Fights are concerned, Final Fight 3 feels the most like it was designed specifically around a home console with all of this story. Now there is an upside to that. You get a little bit more text and a little bit more understanding of what's going on, and there is a slight downside to that depending on how you feel about it. This game is definitely a very long beat 'em up. I played the entire game for this capture, and it took me about 55 minutes to see the end credits scroll. Sure, as far as a home console video game, 55 minutes isn't that long whatsoever, but for a beat 'em up, I've always felt like 30 to 40 minutes is the sweet spot. Anything under that, you feel like the game's over before it starts. Anything over that, and you kind of feel like maybe it's dragging a tiny bit. But definitely it is going to be more fun if you bring a second player and can kind of manage the screen, one player taking the left and one player taking the right. But if you do play this game, you might feel like around that 45-minute mark, things feel just a little bit like they are dragging. And again, I'm not sure what's going on in Metro City, but absolutely everything here is either made of tissue paper, or the characters you play as have superhuman strength, because the amount of damage they've done to walls just to get through them in this franchise must be in the millions of dollars. Now as we move into this factory, that glowing green in the background with all of the different logos on the floor and the enemies you have to fight just really do look very good. I would say this is one of the prettier games on the Super Nintendo, and obviously it was designed directly around that hardware because the arcade teams that made the original weren't really involved in Final Fight 2 or Final Fight 3, but I would say they did a great job of bringing over the entire concept while maintaining that code base just for the Super Nintendo. And it makes sense that these games weren't released in arcades, because at this point in time, arcades were doing decently in North America, but not great. But consoles like Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were absolutely selling a ton, so you had the ability to make a lot more money by doing home console releases than you did arcades. And obviously, a cartridge is cheaper to make than an entire arcade cabinet with the PCB to go along with it. But I would have loved to have seen what a Final Fight could have looked like on the Capcom CPS 2. It would have been interesting. As we move over to Hagar, the only true way to play the game, Stray here is another one of those bosses that has a little bit of that wonky hit detection. It feels like you actually have to be a little bit directly behind his sprite to strike him, or in front of it. If you're perfectly lined up, it seems like sometimes those shots just whiff, and that is going to be a little bit of a bummer. It isn't the worst thing in the world, but this is the first time in Final Fight where I've made that complaint where the hit detection can be off. And as we clothesline him here to his death, I'm going to give you one more soundtrack sample before we get to the back third of the game, because again, as far as Final Fight music is concerned, I would say this is second best only to the arcade original. So listen and I'll be right back. Absolutely awesome soundtrack, and it sounds so good coming out of the Super Nintendo hardware, but again, Capcom always gave us great music for both the arcade and home console games, so you would expect nothing different here. Now unfortunately, this is basically the end of Final Fight 3 until you get to Final Fight Streetwise, and that game proved that Capcom really didn't know what fans wanted an evolution of the franchise to be, because while it's going to be a fun video to watch, it really isn't a great game to play. But we do know there is a market for modern beat-em-ups. We had the recent Streets of Rage 4, we had the recent Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. I would love to see Final Fight come back as a Final Fight 4 in that same modern 2D era. I still think there's a lot of love for this franchise out there, and it's one of those things people would love to see it come back. And if you watch any of my videos on beat 'em ups, you know I don't consider it a true beat 'em up unless we have an elevator level, and we have exactly that here against Joe, which is basically Final Fight's version of a flea man from Castlevania. Tiny, annoying, hard to hit, and it's going to absolutely decimate you if you have your timing wrong, but it's always fun to have an elevator in a beat 'em up game. It's basically a genre staple. but I just wish there was more Final Fight to talk about. As far as the retrospective is concerned, there's only 5 videos in this one. You've already watched Final Fight Revenge just as a bonus episode, because I would say once you get past the 2D games, even though Final Fight Revenge isn't very good, I still enjoy it, and I enjoy it a hell of a lot more than Streetwise. It just feels like Capcom was trying to go into that PlayStation 2 era making what they thought people wanted, but they completely guessed incorrectly, because all anyone really wanted was another awesome entry in 2D in the Final Fight franchise, but we got Streetwise instead, and that is a bummer. But when I say I've been playing these games my entire life, I absolutely mean it. Final Fight, Final Fight 2, and Final Fight 3, I've played a ton, so much so that the original game, my father worked at a hotel in Killington, Vermont as a bartender after he retired from being a dentist, and he had the keys to the arcade room, so he just opened up the cabinet, pump it full of free credits, and I would play on his off hours, and I had an absolute blast doing it. And as we go to the final boss here, this is basically where Final Fight ends. Sure, Streetwise is going to be a fun video to watch, but it's not a fun game to play, so if you really think about this game as a franchise, just stop thinking about it after Final Fight 3 and you won't have any bad memories of where it ended up. But I really do think that there is a place out there in the world for another entry in this franchise, and because I do make the retrospective videos well in advance, maybe it's been announced before this actually airs, and I'm going to sound a little bit stupid saying I hope they do announce one, because it seems like the only series that Capcom is interested in revisiting these days is called Resident Evil, but I think Final Fight definitely deserves that as well. But this has been a super fun retrospective to talk about so far, and unfortunately we do have to close it out on Streetwise, but definitely play this game if you haven't for some strange reason. If you've only played the original Final Fight and you've avoided the sequels on Super Nintendo thinking they aren't as good, you're 100% missing out. Final Fight, Final Fight 2, and Final Fight 3 is maybe the best trilogy of beat-em-up games outside of something like Streets of Rage, and I'm sure some people would argue that is better. But short of that, we're done. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.